January 17th, 1945. Somewhere west of the Rhine. The fog arrived before dawn. It rolled across the frozen German fields in pale waves, swallowing fences, trees, and road signs until the world seemed reduced to shadows and engine noise. Snow from the previous week still clung to the edges of muddy roads where retreating Wehrmacht units had dug shallow defensive positions during the night. The air smelled of wet earth, burned diesel, and cordite. Somewhere in the distance, artillery echoed through the low hills with the slow, rhythmic violence that had become the heartbeat of Europe. Inside a ruined farmhouse near the village crossroads, several exhausted German infantrymen warmed their hands over a weak stove assembled from broken bricks and scrap metal. They had fought for years across Poland, France, Russia, and now their own homeland. Most of them had seen Soviet T-34s smash through fortified lines. They had watched British artillery flatten towns into dust. But the Americans were different. The Americans arrived with noise. With endless trucks, endless fuel, endless cigarettes, endless aircraft overhead, and tanks. The Sherman tank, in particular, had become the subject of bitter jokes among many German soldiers by the winter of 1945. Compared to the heavy Tiger and Panther tanks of Germany, the American M4 Sherman looked narrow, tall, thin-skinned, and vulnerable. German propaganda films frequently emphasized its weaknesses. Wehrmacht crews often referred to it mockingly as the Tommy Cooker, believing it burned easily when hit. On paper, the German soldiers were not entirely wrong. A Panther tank possessed thicker frontal armor and a more powerful main gun than most Sherman variants. A Tiger could destroy enemy armor from extraordinary distances. German engineering emphasized battlefield dominance through superior armor and firepower. The Americans emphasized something else entirely: reliability, mass production, mobility, coordination, and numbers. The German soldiers, near the crossroads that morning, had no intention of retreating further. They believed the terrain favored them. Dense fog reduced visibility to almost nothing. A narrow road cut between frozen fields and shallow woodland. Anti-tank teams carrying Panzerfaust launchers waited in concealed positions behind collapsed stone walls. Somewhere farther back, a Panther tank sat hidden beneath camouflage netting near a churchyard. The Germans expected another slow American probe. 1 or 2 Shermans, perhaps. Easy targets. Easy kills. They had laughed about it during the night. Yet by January 1945, laughter had become dangerous in Germany. Because the war no longer resembled the confident victories of 1940. The Reich was shrinking. Fuel shortages crippled armored divisions. Experienced crews had been killed faster than they could be replaced. Young boys and aging men now occupied trenches once held by hardened veterans. Entire cities burned beneath American and British bombing raids. The Eastern Front was collapsing under Soviet pressure, while in the West, American forces advanced with a momentum Germany increasingly struggled to comprehend. Still, among many German soldiers, faith in German armor remained almost religious. The Panther and Tiger represented more than machines. They represented the final proof that German engineering, discipline, and military culture remained superior to America's industrial approach to warfare. The Shermans symbolized the opposite: mass-produced simplicity. A machine built quickly rather than perfectly. A tank designed not merely to win duels, but to keep moving. And movement was precisely what the Americans understood better than anyone else. The fog thickened as dawn approached. Then came the sound. Not a roar. A vibration. Low and mechanical. Tracks grinding against wet earth somewhere beyond visibility. The German anti-tank teams tightened their grip on their Panzerfausts. Infantrymen moved into firing positions beside shattered windows. The Panther crew inside the churchyard listened carefully through partially opened hatches. One Sherman emerged from the fog first. Then another. Their outlines appeared like ghosts through the gray morning. Thin silhouettes. Narrow turrets. Mud-covered hulls. White stars barely visible beneath grime and snow. One German soldier reportedly laughed aloud. Another muttered that the Americans were sending scrap metal into a slaughter. The first Panzerfaust fired moments later. The rocket screamed through the fog and struck the lead Sherman near its tracks. Flame burst outward instantly. The tank lurched sideways and stopped. German infantry opened fire from concealed positions while machine guns hammered the road. The second Sherman reversed quickly, disappearing back into the mist. For a brief moment, the Germans believed their expectations had been confirmed. Another easy American defeat. Another example of inferior Allied armor collapsing against German resistance. But then the fog shifted, and 5 more Shermans appeared, not advancing recklessly in a straight line, but spreading outward with disciplined coordination. One moved along the road, while 2 others crossed the frozen field to the right. Another maneuvered left toward a tree line. Their turrets rotated constantly, searching through the mist. The Americans had learned. That was one of the most dangerous truths German soldiers encountered during the final years of the war. American forces adapted quickly, painfully at times, but relentlessly. Early encounters in North Africa had exposed weaknesses in American armored doctrine. German anti-tank tactics inflicted severe losses. Panthers and Tigers dominated long-range engagements. Yet by 1944 and 1945, American tank crews rarely fought alone. Shermans operated alongside infantry, artillery spotters, fighter bombers, reconnaissance units, and mobile logistics columns that maintained pressure hour after hour. The Sherman itself evolved continuously throughout the war. Improved ammunition storage reduced catastrophic fires. Better guns increased anti-armor capability. New suspension systems enhanced mobility across difficult terrain. Most importantly, there were always more Shermans. Factories across the United States produced nearly 50,000 Sherman tanks during the war. Detroit assembly lines operated with astonishing speed. American industrial power transformed civilian manufacturing into military output on a scale the Axis powers struggled to match. Germany engineered masterpieces. America engineered systems. And systems were harder to destroy. The 5 Shermans advancing through the fog that January morning represented more than armored vehicles. They represented an entire industrial civilization moving west to east with unstoppable momentum. Inside the German positions, confidence began to weaken. Machine gun fire intensified from the American tanks while supporting infantry emerged behind them, advancing cautiously through the frozen fields. Mortar rounds exploded near the stone walls where Panzerfaust teams hid. One Sherman fired high explosive shells into the upper floors of a ruined barn suspected of concealing German observers. The Panther near the churchyard finally opened fire. Its first shell struck one Sherman directly in the turret, tearing through armor and igniting ammunition. The explosion lit the fog orange. Burning fuel spilled across the road. For a moment, German morale surged again. The Panther was still king. 1 shot, 1 kill. Yet even this revealed the growing imbalance between the two armies by 1945. The Panther fired again and missed. Then American artillery arrived. Not randomly, precisely. Forward observers embedded with the advancing units had already identified likely German armor positions. Within minutes, shells crashed around the churchyard. Trees splintered. Masonry shattered. Dirt and snow erupted into the air. The Panther attempted to reposition but struggled in the muddy terrain. Then fighter aircraft appeared overhead. Even through heavy cloud cover, the Americans maintained terrifying coordination between ground and air forces during the final year of the war. P-47 Thunderbolts prowled roads and villages searching for movement. German crews increasingly feared Allied aircraft more than enemy tanks. The Panther retreated before it could fire again. And the Shermans continued forward. This pattern repeated itself throughout Western Europe during 1944 and 1945. German heavy armor often won individual engagements. America won campaigns. Sherman crews understood their disadvantages. Many privately admitted the fear inspired by Panthers and Tigers. Tank commanders knew German guns could penetrate their armor at long distances. Casualty rates among American armored units were severe, especially after Normandy. But American doctrine never relied upon a single weapon dominating the battlefield alone. The Sherman functioned as part of a larger machine. When one tank was destroyed, another replaced it. When roads collapsed, Engineers rebuilt them. When fuel ran low, convoys arrived. When units advanced too quickly, entire mobile supply systems followed behind. To exhausted German soldiers, this abundance appeared almost supernatural. Captured Wehrmacht officers frequently commented on American logistics with disbelief. The endless stream of trucks, fuel cans, spare parts, food supplies, ammunition crates, and replacement vehicles seemed impossible to interrupt completely. Germany increasingly fought a defensive war against an opponent whose material resources appeared limitless. And symbolism mattered deeply in war. For German soldiers, the panther represented pride, technical excellence, and the image of elite military superiority. For the Americans, the Sherman represented something broader: dependability, not perfection, persistence. A machine ordinary mechanics could repair quickly. A tank young crews could learn rapidly. A vehicle that crossed continents because thousands more always followed behind it. In many ways, the Sherman reflected the United States itself during World War II. Not invincible, not flawless, but overwhelming in scale. As the battle near the crossroads intensified, the fog slowly began to thin. American infantry pushed into the village, while Sherman tanks provided suppressive fire against upper-story windows and defensive strongpoints. German resistance fractured into isolated pockets. Several surviving German soldiers later described the emotional exhaustion that defined the war's final months in the West. They no longer fought with expectations of victory. Instead, they fought to delay collapse. The Americans sensed this. Unlike the brutal annihilation unfolding on the Eastern Front between Germany and the Soviet Union, Western Allied forces often encountered surrendering German units willing to abandon hopeless positions once encirclement seemed inevitable. Yet the fighting remained deadly. An American Sherman advancing near the churchyard struck a concealed mine, blowing apart its suspension and trapping the crew inside. German machine gun fire pinned nearby infantry in open ground. Another Sherman maneuvered forward under fire, using its hull to shield wounded soldiers while medics evacuated casualties behind it. These moments rarely appeared in propaganda reels. War was not clean heroism. It was confusion, mud, fear, exhaustion, and machinery colliding in frozen fields. But within that violence, perceptions changed. Many German soldiers entered the war believing American society lacked discipline and seriousness. Nazi propaganda often portrayed the United States as materialistic, racially divided, and militarily weak. German officers sometimes dismissed Americans as soft civilians incapable of enduring prolonged hardship. Those assumptions became increasingly difficult to maintain after Normandy. American soldiers crossed oceans, stormed beaches, fought through hedgerows, forests, and frozen mountain ranges, while enduring enormous casualties. Their equipment kept arriving. Their artillery remained devastating. Their aircraft controlled the skies. Their tanks kept moving even after suffering losses that would have crippled smaller armies. Most shocking of all to many Germans was the realization that America's apparent abundance itself had become a weapon. The cigarettes, the coffee, the heated rations, the fresh uniforms, the endless gasoline. Even deep into winter campaigns, American troops often possessed luxuries unimaginable to exhausted German defenders surviving on shrinking supplies. Captured Wehrmacht soldiers sometimes expressed astonishment at the quantity of food available to ordinary American infantrymen. Coffee became one of the recurring symbols mentioned in countless wartime accounts. The smell alone carried meaning. Hot coffee drifting from American camps represented warmth, logistics, and stability. For hungry German soldiers retreating through destroyed towns, it symbolized an enemy nation untouched by the devastation consuming Europe. Factories in Detroit, Pittsburgh, and Chicago still operated safely across an ocean while German cities burned beneath bombing raids. That imbalance changed morale as much as bullets did. Near the crossroads, the battle ended shortly after noon. The remaining German defenders withdrew eastward under artillery pressure, while American engineers cleared mines from the road. Damaged Shermans smoldered beside frozen ditches. Medics treated wounded men from both sides in the shadow of shattered buildings. The village itself possessed little strategic importance. Yet thousands of similar engagements collectively revealed why Germany was losing the war. Not because German soldiers lacked courage, not because every American weapon proved technically superior, but because modern war had become industrial. And no nation on Earth matched the industrial capacity of the United States during World War II. American shipyards launched vessels faster than German submarines could sink them. Aircraft factories produced bombers in astonishing numbers. Tank plants replaced losses at rates Germany could no longer sustain. Oil flowed across Allied supply lines while German fuel reserves dwindled catastrophically. By 1945, German tank crews often abandoned perfectly functional Panthers simply because fuel no longer existed to operate them. The Sherman kept moving. Its reliability became strategic. General Dwight Eisenhower later described logistics as one of the decisive elements of Allied victory. Other commanders emphasized the same reality repeatedly throughout the war. Armies advanced only as fast as supplies allowed. In this environment, the Sherman's mechanical simplicity became an enormous advantage over more complex German designs that required greater maintenance and strained supply systems already near collapse. Even German generals acknowledged this after the war. Many admired American operational flexibility despite believing individual German tanks remained superior in direct combat. Yet battlefield history rarely rewards isolated superiority. It rewards sustainability. As American forces crossed deeper into Germany during early 1945, more civilians encountered the strange contradiction embodied by the Sherman columns rolling through their towns. The tanks looked dirty, practical, almost crude compared to the intimidating elegance of German armor. Yet they never stopped coming. Children watched endless convoys move along roads choked with refugees and retreating troops. Farmers stared as columns of trucks stretched beyond the horizon. Captured German officers studied American supply depots with disbelief. The scale itself carried psychological force. And behind the machinery came another unexpected reality. Many Germans had been taught to expect brutality from invading armies. Nazi propaganda portrayed the Allies as savage destroyers intent upon exterminating Germany entirely. Fear spread rapidly through civilian populations as the front approached. But experiences varied. In numerous Western towns, civilians encountered American soldiers distributing food, treating wounded children, or allowing frightened families to shelter beside military kitchens during artillery bombardments. This did not erase the destruction of war. Entire German cities still lay in ruins. Bombing campaigns had killed enormous numbers of civilians. Combat remained violent and traumatic. Yet individual moments mattered. A cup of coffee offered to a surrendered soldier. Chocolate handed to a child. A medic treating enemy wounded. These scenes challenged years of ideological conditioning. The Sherman tank itself sometimes became part of those memories. Not merely as a weapon, but as a symbol of arrival. The arrival of overwhelming force. The arrival of the end. And eventually, for many, the arrival of a different political reality altogether. Historians often emphasize battles, commanders, and treaties when describing World War II. Yet ordinary perceptions also shaped the post-war world profoundly. Millions of Europeans experienced firsthand the economic and industrial differences between democratic America and collapsing fascist regimes. They saw it in equipment, in logistics, in food supplies, in medical care, in the confidence of soldiers who believed replacement equipment would arrive tomorrow because factories thousands of miles away continued operating safely. That confidence became contagious, even among enemies. One captured German officer reportedly remarked that fighting the Americans felt less like fighting an army and more like fighting an entire continent. The Sherman represented that continent in steel form. Not the most feared tank, not the most heavily armored, but perhaps the most important Allied tank of the war precisely because it embodied American strategic philosophy so completely. Mobility over perfection. Production over scarcity. Adaptation over rigidity. As winter faded into spring during 1945, Sherman tanks continued advancing eastward through collapsing German defenses. They crossed rivers, rolled through industrial cities, and linked with Soviet forces deep inside the defeated Reich. Many crews who survived the war carried complicated feelings about the vehicle afterward. They knew its weaknesses intimately. They knew friends who had died inside burning hulls after direct hits from German guns. Yet they also knew the Sherman had carried them across Europe. And history followed those tracks. The war ended in Europe on May 8, 1945. By then, Germany's once proud armored divisions existed mostly as wreckage scattered across roadsides and ruined cities. Fuel shortages, air attacks, artillery, and relentless Allied advances had shattered the Wehrmacht's ability to maneuver effectively. Meanwhile, thousands of Shermans remained operational. Some would continue serving in conflicts decades after World War II ended. Others were melted down, abandoned, or displayed in museums where visitors still compare them to the larger German tanks they faced. At first glance, many observers continue asking the same question German soldiers once asked in frozen villages and ruined fields. How did this thinner tank win? The answer lies not merely in armor thickness or gun caliber. It lies in systems, factories, road networks, training programs, shipyards, fuel reserves, radio coordination, repair crews, and the political-industrial culture capable of sustaining total war across multiple continents simultaneously. The Sherman was never meant to be a dueling champion. It was designed to keep moving while an entire civilization moved with it. That was the true shock experienced by many German soldiers during the final years of the war. Not simply that American tanks existed in large numbers, but that behind every destroyed Sherman waited another column emerging through the fog. And behind those columns stood factories untouched by invasion, oceans controlled by Allied navies, and a democratic industrial machine operating at full power. The laughter faded because reality became impossible to ignore. The thin Sherman kept coming. Again.
And again.
And again. Even now, decades later, photographs from the winter of 1945 retain a haunting quality. Sherman tanks advancing through mist-covered European villages. Young American crews bundled against the cold. German prisoners marching beside roads lined with destroyed armor. Civilians watching silently from broken doorways. The images feel suspended between worlds. One world collapsing, another arriving. The fog from that January morning eventually disappeared beneath sunlight. The damaged tanks were cleared from the road. Graves were dug near the village church. Survivors continued eastward toward the final months of the war. But the symbolism endured, because the Sherman tank ultimately represented more than military machinery. It represented the power of abundance over scarcity, of production over ideology, of systems durable enough to survive catastrophe. German heavy tanks inspired fear. The Sherman inspired momentum. And momentum, once fully unleashed across Europe in 1944 and 1945, became nearly unstoppable. Long after the gunfire ended, former soldiers from both sides remembered the sound first. The grinding tracks emerging through fog, the engines approaching steadily through frozen fields, the realization that more tanks were coming, always more. For exhausted German defenders standing inside the ruins of a collapsing Reich, that sound carried the weight of inevitability itself. Not elegant, not theatrical, just relentless, like factories operating through the night and ocean away, like convoys crossing endless roads, like democracy transformed into steel, gasoline, coffee, radios, and machinery. The thin Sherman rolled forward through the fog, and behind it came the modern world.